All right, well, welcome. Welcome to the first session of this BAD Festival. Thank you all for turning up this Thursday morning. I have to do a little bit of housekeeping, so just bear with me. We also have a lot of Zoom audience members today as well. So they'll be watching on this monitor. They'll also be giving us questions through the monitor. So if we're not paying you attention, we're looking at the people who are watching from the libraries and at home. So also welcome to those who are joining us from Zoom and throughout New South Wales in their local libraries. We are really great that sort of you can join us from all around it. You don't actually have to come into the State Library as we have done. But we would need to kick things off with a acknowledgement of country. And today we are on Gadigal land, and as we gather to share stories and knowledge, let's reflect on the rich history of storytelling in this place. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people in the audience today. Now, as I said, a little bit of housekeeping. Please ensure that your phones are switched to silent or turned off, so we don't want any interruptions. If you can't record the session, but you can take photos. If you are taking photos, please turn off the flash and remember to share them on social media, either using the at Bad Sydney hashtag or Bad Crime Sydney 22. In the unlikely event of an emergency evacuation, we will leave through the door that you entered and exit the building via the Mitchell vestibule main doors and down the front stairs to an assembly point in the domain. Our security guards will direct you, so please follow their instructions. My name is insert name here. No, it's Andy Muir, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Metcalfe room, not the Dixon room. We will be having a fantastic discussion with these debut authors today, hearing about their books, hearing about their work. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions from you. So as you're listening, think up some nice questions for our team. And if you're joining us on Zoom, please send your questions through using the chat function, and we will endeavour to answer those or question those as well and include them. So let's get these things on the road. The Bad Sydney Crime Festival sort of started in an effort to lift the profile of crime fiction in Australia. It was kind of being neglected a little bit, despite the quality of the work. And I think that this year's festival, in particular this session, really demonstrates how far the profile of crime fiction in this country has come and the strength of writing and stories and writers that we're seeing. And I really think that the Bad Sydney Crime Festival has been played a role in that. So thank you for coming along and participating, and thank you to all of our authors who are on the stage today. We have some really interesting books today. We have 2 stories that are set in rural Australia. We have one from Western Sydney, and we have one from the inner city Melbourne. Quite a diverse range of stories that we're going to be exploring. And I just need to get my sheet. Here it is here. With those stories, we've got a whole range. We have procedurals, we have private investigators, we have people who are just curious about crime. So I think that really we should sort of start things off with, why did our authors choose these stories, or did their stories choose them? Does anyone want to kind of leap in and sort of tackle this tricky question that's starting the panel?
Oh, I'll go, because I think often I'm sort of, and I think Shelley would get this too, you're like, oh, you've caught this wave of sort of outback noir. And really, honestly, I grew up in a town not too dissimilar to Durton, the fictional town, in my book, and it was something that I didn't even really want to write about. I set out, actually, did a PhD in creative writing, which is where this novel came out of, but I started with a novel set in space. I wanted to do something completely different. But when I sat down and wrote a short story about this place that I knew well, suddenly I had the details to hand. And, sometimes you're told, write what you know or write what you can imagine. And I think write what you can give detail to. And I think all of us do that here in different ways. So I don't think you have to come from a place to write about it. I mean, Sally, I know you weren't living in Melbourne when you wrote this book, for example, but...
Oh, I wasn't. When I started it, I was living in the Fitzroy Carlton area, but For the last 20 years, most of the time I have lived in Darwin. So, yeah, very different.
And I think sometimes being away from the place you're writing about is excellent because it sort of heightens. I wrote most of this book in coastal Wollongong, but I was drawing on childhood memory and I also went back there. And I think that gives you, I don't know, it gives you space or sort of, I don't know, you're able to maybe see it more clearly sometimes by stepping back. I'm curious what you think. Because you're living regionally now, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I live in Tallangatta now in Victoria, which is very dissimilar from the setting of Wake because, you know, it's a massive country. But when I was writing Wake, I did the bulk of the writing in the National Library in Canberra, which I would say conceptually is about as far from central New South Wales as you can get, because it's a beautiful building, but it's also a very colonial building and it's very structured and constructed as opposed to what I was trying to conjure up with Wake, which is a very, I suppose, constructed in a different way because we have significantly changed the landscape through farming and agriculture. But at the same time, there's still a sense of just wildness and being right at the edge of anything that gives you a sense of safety. Because, you know, you can walk 100 meters out of your front door in a space like that and just be completely surrounded by nature and look around yourself and realize that there's nobody else potentially for kilometers, which was the feeling that I was really trying to capture with my setting, which was very much drawn from those same childhood memories. My grandparents had a property. I'm not allowed to call it a farm anymore. My grandfather actually pulled me up on it, that it was a rural property because they didn't make their living from agriculture. So I'm not allowed to call it a farm anymore. But it was 10 hectares outside of Glenrowan, and I would just spend hours just wandering through the paddocks and through the bush and come back for meal times. And that was really the feeling that I was trying to capture.
I think you did a great job with that too. It does have that kind of authenticity of someone who knows a landscape and is walking through it. But we'll get to that because Matthew, your story.
So my story is, I suppose my story chose me a little bit in that I had a sort of founding idea, which was a journalist is sent back to a very old boys' boarding school where he was born and raised. And I'm a journalist who grew up on a very old boys' boarding school out at North Parramatta. So that was the idea for the book, and it was interesting now thinking about it that the setting was enmeshed in that idea. So I think, and as Hayley says, in a way I chose it because it made it easier for me and then hopefully for the reader as well, if you're not imagining that space that is the central setting of your book. But also, having said that, I hadn't been there for 30 years and I didn't go back there when I was writing it. So it sort of was my childhood memories that I called upon.
Did you go back at all in the drafting process?
Oh, look, I went back for a funeral for an old teacher, but no, not really. It really was ingrained in me. And I mean, things would have changed out there since I'd been there. And I sort of went with my old version. I didn't try and make it accurate. Yep.
I felt that with my town as well. It sort of, in the end, it didn't matter that I wasn't trying to make a replica of a real place. I was trying to kind of plug in an emotional truth and make that feel true for the reader. And so certain real details were helpful with that, but I also gave myself lots of space to make things up. And I think that's sometimes what we want in fiction, that true affect, like that truth feeling, more than caring about a forensic, understanding of exactly how far it is from the nearest big town or something like that, in my example.
What about you, Sally? Did you sort of, you're based in NT. Did you have to go back to Melbourne a lot to remind yourself of what Brunswick was like?
Well, I would have loved to have gone back and do the edit in a coffee shop in Brunswick Street. I would have just really loved that. But alas, I got the word that it was getting published in March 2020. So, and we were just a lock-in state in the NT. We were living life pretty normally, but we couldn't leave. Or if we did leave, we might not be able to get back without having quarantine and spending lots of money on, staying in a donga in the edge of town. So I didn't go back. I had to, And it is set in the past. It is set in 2007, which is the last time I lived in this area, which is my excuse for things having changed a little bit.
Mhm.
But I did just have to ring people up and say, am I remembering this correctly? Is this, how do you get to there again? Or where, So, I had to use Brains Trust. And Google's really good.
Yeah.
Googled a lot.
Street View.
I would have loved to go back there and just, spend a couple of months just in a coffee shops, editing, writing, rewriting.
I think time is sometimes an underrated element of setting, in terms of when it happens affects the location and the way that it's acting upon the characters as much as kind of anything. So my story set in 2001 and then in certain parts goes back into the 80s and 90s through kind of flashback. And I think it was, for me, it was as important that the time and getting the details of the time right as the sort of physical landscape.
Yeah. I had the same thing because Wake it was not intended to be historical. It's set in 2018, which is very much a contemporary, but I always assumed that when it did come time to publish, that I would change the details and move those dates forward and it would be set in, the present time. And then 2020 happened. And so when I told people this book is set in 2018, everybody said, oh, good idea. So it did end up becoming suddenly 2018 is a bit of a foreign country. So.
And is that's true for all, we all skip the virus, don't we?
Yeah, my book is set sort of in the present. I don't give it a year. But I just completely ignored the virus. I started it before COVID, and there was one line in it which I think one person says to another, social distancing. And in the end, we decided to cut that out as well, just because,
But then that could also be interpreted as some sort of, personal quirk as well. It's not necessarily a COVID thing.
Yeah, I made it up, yeah.
Like that kid in primary school who come up to you really close and then spin their arms out and go, personal space, and then whack you in the side of the arm.
That's really interesting with your work, Hayley, because that sort of child perspective, this sort of young teenager perspective of the world is captured so perfectly. I mean, how did you sort of go about that sort of process? Was it just mining your own memories?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's 5 points of view in my book, and you're right that children are sort of 60% of that kind of point of view schema. I've got this chorus of kids, which is really kind of stands in for the town, and that was where I really got to draw on details that I remembered, those things that just I don't know, felt and were kind of trying to speak to childhood in general. But I think my goal was that you open the book to any page and you knew exactly who was kind of speaking. And so I think setting is always activated by the person who you're kind of focalized through, right? So Lewis, my young sort of scared boy, feels very differently about the town than Ronnie, my sort of young girl who has grown, sort of feels at home there, and that's the source of all her happy memories, right? And so it's really interesting how you can have the same landscape, but as different characters move through it. And it's sort of interesting because I left the town where I grew up when I was 12, and so all the kids kind of age out at 12. All of those child voices are 12 or younger. And then you've got Constance, who's the mother of the missing girl, who moves from Melbourne later in life and is always going to be an outsider. And then you've got my cop character, who's sort of a Sydney cop who comes in from out. So I think it's that was the way I wanted to look at the town, as someone who, as children who, I think all children, you don't know that there are other options as a kid, right? That's where you are is your reality. And that's true of a child who lives in New York, as true as a child who lives in a town like Durton. And then it was also interesting to take adults who kind of know what else is out there, who come in and see the town in different ways. So I was very much thinking about that as I put the book together.
Mm. And there's probably a few people that have heard, this term Greek chorus around your work. Could you just maybe explain what a Greek chorus is? Because it's relevant to a couple of the books on this panel.
Yeah, so, in a traditional Greek play, you'd have a group of actors come out, or and kind of comment on the action, right? They'd say, oh no, the hero is about to do this, or we are now in Thebes and this is going to happen. And so I was really interested in that idea of people speaking together, because it's really unusual in fiction. Usually it's I did this or he or she did that, right? So there's something about, often when we speak as a collective, it's because we've been through a shared experience. And really that was how my book started. It was, okay, I've got this collective of children that are speaking together when I sit down to write them. What's happened? Oh, a girl's gone missing. That would totally be the kind of thing that would make people go, what were you doing on the day that that happened?
Yeah.
So I think it's an unusual point of view, but I think it really allows you to directly access questions of what brings us together and what sort of tears us apart. So I'm really interested in it.
Well, I thought it was really interesting with your work, Shelley, that through Wake, we have this kind of murder forum where people are commenting on the crime, and it's almost acting in that sort of collective voice, like this Greek chorus. It could also just be a group of crime writers talking, but were you sort of conscious of that sort of collective voice when you do it?
Yeah, that's right. I in a more colloquial sense refer to the forum discussions as my Greek chorus. That was just such a fantastic thing to play with as a writer, because you've got this group of characters who are in the main story, and it's a very closed off space. It's a town, it's far away from everything. The characters are a very small group. And then with the murder forum, I was able to step back and tell the story of how the main narrative is being perceived from the outside. So certain things were leaking out into the media. Some of the people on the forum are actually local to the town and were sharing information, or they were pulling information from other places. And so that was really interesting. And the murder forums themselves were really the original kernel of the idea for Wake. I was reading them myself for a period. I wasn't trying to research for a novel. I was just, going through a little obsession, as you do. I was reading all of these forums on unsolved crimes that people on them sort of, amateur detectives trying to pull together all of the known public information, find things that might have been missed. There's some really amazing people on there, and they do some great things. Like they'll fundraise to get DNA testing done. They'll, dig up really under-resourced or forgotten cases and bring attention to them. Sometimes the families of victims will actively seek these people out and will try to get their case noticed, just because, it's cold and there's no progress and they're desperate for anything. But there's a sort of darker flip side as well, is that some of this is very invasive and done without the family's consent. You're seeing more of a conversation happening about that now. At the time, I started writing this in 2018, and it's been really interesting to watch that conversation start to get louder, particularly when it comes to things like YouTube true crime, where people are making really quite large amounts of money from other people's tragedies, often without their permission. And so I was reading these forums, and I was reading one particular conversation about the brother of a victim, and they were getting very invasive in the way that they were trying to pull information on him from the internet. And I just thought, oh, if that was me, I would be so angry. And that anger was really what sparked the idea for Wake. And so bringing those murder conversations, those murder forum conversations in, sort of let me comment on that, but also comment on the story, bring in information, bring in misinformation, and just really show the way it was being perceived.
Yeah, I think it works really well. It's a different kind of way of entering the story and getting that sort of all important, information drops done efficiently. But in terms of your work, Sally, I thought that you also were sort of using this kind of Greek chorus. I mean, with your book, I kind of saw it as being really, there's a sense of Lee Redhead and Shane Maloney's kind of Melbourne in there, and you've got sort of the Greek chorus working in the pubs, and the people kind of giving. You have to kind of share your character's name because it's a fantastic character.
Oh, yeah. The main character in my book is Brick Brown, and she works in a pub, or she used to exclusively work in a pub in Fitzroy owned by her uncle, but due to various events, she's gone to work in a council, which readers have appreciated a lot. I've got a lot of feedback saying that gave them a laugh, though some say it's very inaccurate. And I'm like, yes, it's not true to life, but we poke a lot of fun at council. Yeah. But she really belongs in a pub.
Yeah, it's her natural territory.
Yeah, natural territory, the pub. Yeah. So that's what inspired it, thinking, because I grew up in suburban Geelong in Victoria. And when I went to Melbourne as an 18-year-old, I just thought Fitzroy was just the grooviest place on earth. I couldn't believe it. So I thought, imagine if you'd grown up here, what would you be like? And so that's what Brick Brown is. She's grown up in that area. Oh, and she's grown up in a pub. What is her life like? And of course, then it turned into a crime story because, you know,
because they're the best stories.
They're the best stories, yeah.
and Matthew, of course, your book is around a journalist, or centered around a journalist, the role of the media in crime, which again is kind of a modern day sort of chorus. It's a really interesting portrayal of the relationship between the police and the media. And you have a background yourself as a journalist. I mean, how much were you drawing on that experience?
Well, I drew on my experience as a journalist a lot for my character, Adam Bowman, who in early drafts of the book was the main thrust of the story. And then I had some editorial advice that maybe the police investigation should be the thrust of the story, and the media and the journalist is then a strong subplot. So I had to think about that and whether I wanted to do it. And when I decided I would, I called on my journalism again, because it meant interviewing a lot of police officers to try and get a little bit of a sense of what drives, one, what would drive them emotionally, why they're doing their job, but also to say to them, look, this is what's happening in the story. What would you be doing? So I guess in both ways, I did call on the journalism. One was just knowing, you know, how a newsroom works, and the other was really asking people questions. But the pub thing's interesting because I think one thing that links all four books is there seems to be pubs in all of them. So
well, they're Australian, so
Australian crime, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Adam, because he's not very good at his job, which is kind of interesting for a main, or you know, a sort of a main character. We kind of often see characters that are at their excellence, and they're characters we want to emulate or admire. But he's kind of off, you know, with hangovers. He's asking the wrong questions. He's causing problems.
Yeah, I suppose I didn't want to. I mean, I'd read sort of other writers sort of warning about, you know, if you sit down and write a book like this and you're pulling bits of yourself into your character, like we share the same profession, things, it can come across that you're writing propaganda for yourself. And so I suppose it was a defense mechanism. I didn't really want to have people sort of reading it and thinking, oh, this is how Matthew sees himself. You know, we don't see Matthew like this, but this is how he sees himself. And I think also his vulnerability and things probably make him more interesting. Journalists don't tend to solve crimes. They might report on them, they might commit them, but, you know. So I didn't want to go down that route, but also I suppose to balance that in the book, there's a police detective who's another point of view character, and she is probably quite good at her job. And the sort of story drives through her. So I suppose that balances things up in that way.
Yeah.
I love this idea that of avoiding kind of big upping yourself in fiction, because I feel like one reason I'm a fiction writer and will always be a fiction writer is it allows me to sort of hand out all of my negative qualities and weird idiosyncrasies and kind of obsessions to a cast of people. So where it seems just about right when you spread it out over about 5 characters, you're like, yeah, they have little quirks, that's fine. You know, so I'm just plugging in those.
Yeah. We put them all together, there's Hayley.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I won't tell you which bits, you know.
Yeah, no, like my main character, Mina, is very much who I would be if I wasn't so desperate to be liked.
Well, I'm nothing like Brick Brown because she's too groovy, but she has this friend in it called Sue who writes real estate reviews and then has to go home to the kids, and I feel that Sue is me.
Oh, well, we might sort of avoid that one. Or maybe if someone in the audience can think of a good question about that one. Another interesting thing about these 4 books is that they're all kind of exploring ideas about the past, secrets, shame and judgments. Was that a kind of conscious sort of decision to kind of, is shame always associated with judgment?
I was very interested in shame, and particularly like, you know, we've talked about child narration in my book, and I think children, we often think of childhood as a very innocent time, but for me, I remember feeling incredible shame, and like looking back on it, I kind of just want to pat myself on the head and say, oh, that's okay, love. Like, you didn't need to be that worried about it. But that sense of you can sense when something's wrong, or you can sense what's happening, but you have no power to do anything about it, you know. And I think what happened when I took my children and their kind of feeling seriously is that they then became more enmeshed in the plot. You know, the things that they're worried about and the things that they're doing have ripple on sort of effects in the story. So I think anytime you take any kind of element of your character seriously, it's amazing how it can kind of spread out and connect on a plot level, on a kind of I think you can kind of pick any emotional frame to enter your story in, and I think shame was a really big one for me. And often the people that experience shame in my book are the least deserving of shame. And then there are like some really awful people that are not, that could do with a bit of shame, could do it, because shame is, you know, is described as an emotion that kind of helps us regulate to stay within society in a way, to kind of, you know, but when it becomes corrosive and it becomes, I'm thinking in particular of my character Lewis, who feels so much shame and so much fear, and you know, really drives the events of the plot. But you kind of just want to reach out and say, this is not your fault. Like, this is all going to be okay. And that was a big part of his character and kind of the book as a whole for me. Yeah.
I like it how you refer to your children. My children. It's funny how our characters become real. Matthew, I sort of was thinking also with your book, like your character is really carrying a big burden from his past. Do you think that that's, you know, is that sort of a driver for that character? That's, you know, could he do another story now that you sort of addressed that?
I think he could, yeah. Interestingly, though, that problem that emerges in his past wasn't tacked on to the story, but it did evolve, you know, as the book got redrafted, so it probably wasn't there in the first or second draft. And really, to begin with, it's there as a plot device and almost a trope of crime fiction. So it's a character going back to a place he knows well or has grown up, and the idea is something's gone wrong in his past. And the reader gets a sense of that early, being in his head, but realistically, if you're in his head and he's sort of going about his business, he's not going to be thinking about it constantly. So it's more just there's sort of twinges about it, and then it's something that is later unearthed by the police characters. So I suppose it's there to flesh out his character, but also really it's almost a plot device.
And like your Brick's sort of past problem, it becomes revealed. Well, not revealed, but she just...
My character, yeah, she's had there's been a trauma in her childhood, which she has totally forgotten and realised that she's forgotten, and has deliberately turned her back on it and said, I'm not going there. I'm not, and even though, yeah, she is at that, she's in her late 20s and she's sort of stuck in her life, not progressing forward. And partly it is because she won't look backward. And it's when her uncle, who she loves, who owns the pub, mysteriously goes missing. And by the nature of Baz, as he is, she's not quite sure if he's gone missing or if he's just gone AWOL. So she doesn't go to the police or anything because he wouldn't like her to do that. But yes, events start happening that make her actually start looking at what did happen, and pushing her to evolve, because she's been determined not to.
And it's interesting with poor old Mina. She's really sort of stuck at that point, isn't she? She's been unable to get past this tragedy with her sister.
Absolutely, yes. I think that in writing this one, I was really fascinated with the way that people will lie in the course of a murder investigation for reasons totally unrelated to the murder. Because I think going back to that little obsessive period that I had of reading the true crime forums, is I remember seeing the way people would pick apart inconsistencies in the stories particularly when it came to the death or disappearance of children. And then obviously you look at the parents, because statistically it probably was the parents. And like they'll just pick strange inconsistencies in the story. And I remember I was reading one where the parents were behaving really oddly and the timelines didn't match up. And I remember sitting there thinking, you know what I think's happened here? I think the parents have just lied about what time they put their kids to bed because they were embarrassed and they don't want to be seen as bad parents. And so I think that just really fascinates me. And I can see it's coming up again as a theme in the second one as I'm writing it, just the way that people will tell a little lie and that lie will snowball, particularly when there is a murder involved. And so part of the course of solving a murder mystery is unpicking all of those little self-defensive lies that people have told for reasons completely unrelated to crimes, but they still have to be set right before you can clear everything away and see what really happened here.
So are you all working on follow-up books to these, or are you going to? Do we have favourite characters that you want to bring back, or?
I'm writing something that is not has no kind of follow-through characters, no. And in a way, I went right. No children. You know, I'm not working with kids or animals again. And I'm not doing a big point of view. You know, there's 5 points of view in this book. There's going to be 1 point of view in the next book, because I think I wanted to keep it interesting for myself. I would love to one day go back to Sarah Michael. She was a character that was the last character into my book. You know, I didn't want to write a police procedural. I didn't want but as readers read the story and said, oh, we want more. We want to know more about what's happening. I had to go deeper into her. And the more you go into a character, the more you kind of have to, the more of them, the more of yourself you give to them, and then you're fond of them and you want them, you know. So I would, if I were to return, it would be her, but I would go back in time. I would not be what happens after Dirttown. It would be her coming up as a young cop in sort of Sydney in the 90s, I think would be really interesting, but too much research for me to contemplate right now. Not in the mood.
A lot of corruption.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would be a dark and deep kind of hole to go into, but it'd be fun.
Yeah. Is anyone else is Adam going to come back?
I'm not sure about Adam. I think he may emerge in a third book, but in the second book, it's the Riley character who's the police detective and her underling in Black River. So it's a detective sergeant, a detective constable in a similar story to Black River. I couldn't really set it at a private boys' boarding school, so I've had to go elsewhere.
Private girls' school.
Yeah.
Full diversity.
Yeah. And again, Hayley, because my book has 3 points of view, this one has 1, and it's basically being seen through the eyes of Riley.
Oh, yeah, well, I'd started on an outback crime, but it seems like the market's a bit flooded. So I'm resting that for the moment. And I thought, oh, how hard is it to write a sequel to, have further adventures of Brick Brown? So I'll give that a go. It turns out it's not as easy as I thought it might be, but I'm still giving it a go.
She could move to Darwin, yeah?
She could move. People have said, oh, she could move to Darwin. I did actually start a sequel set in Darwin, and I don't know if I'll pursue that one.
Oh, you should. I love her. I would love to see her go on more adventures. So no pressure, but
yeah. Well, I am. Yeah, she is in the sequel, but we're still in Melbourne. I think we're going to be in Melbourne a bit longer before she takes off to Darwin. Yeah. Under mysterious circumstances, no doubt.
It's kind of funny because, like, with Brick, she's also one of the few characters in these books that's not an outsider.
It's true. Yeah, I'm like the kid that one of these kids is not like the others. I've written this sort of somewhat funny black comedy crime.
But there's a
she's not an outsider.
Are you calling us bleak, Sally?
They're quite serious themes in your book. There are serious themes in this too, and a lot about real estate and development, corruption, all the things that people love in Melbourne. Prices of real estate,
plastic recycling.
A little bit about that. Councils, taking a kick at councils.
But it would be really interesting to kind of see Brick in a situation that she's not familiar with, that she doesn't kind of know, that sort of outsider perspective.
Yeah. Oh, she does. She's an outsider in the when she goes to work at council, she doesn't know what she's doing because she's, spent her whole life working in pubs. So she's a bit of an outsider at council, but but not in Melbourne. In the tiny little area of Melbourne that she lives and never leaves, she's very at home. So yeah, that's
It's
well
very,
observed.
very Melbourne. You don't cross the river.
No, she doesn't cross the river. God.
North or south. And then like with Shelley, with Lane, like he's again that outsider. Were you kind of interested in exploring that outsider perspective, or was it more a choice because it allowed you to kind of go to different places?
I think that like Lane is an outsider, and then you've got Mina, who has always lived in the town and is very integrated into the community, but doesn't see herself that way. And so it was interesting being able to contrast someone who is very at home there with someone who feels very much on the outside and sees the people of the town trying to keep him out. But Lane's childhood was very mobile. He travelled around the Murray-Darling Basin, and I had a very mobile childhood in a very similar way that I grew up in a split custody situation. My mother lived in Newcastle and my father lived in Wangaratta, and I would spend his custody time on my grandparents' rural property outside of Glenrowan, which, you know, that's about an 8-hour drive. They're very far apart. And so we would travel a massive distance at every switchover. And so I really felt more kinship with that very outsider perspective, coming into a small town, traveling all of the time, seeing places, but never really fully existing in any of them. So I really enjoyed getting to speak in that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense as well, doesn't it? Because, you know, for the reader, they're kind of getting that outsider view as well that sort of allows them to kind of see things fresh with that outsider too. It looks like we're getting sort of the signal. So those of you at home, remember to sort of type in your questions, and in the audience, I hope you've all got your thinking caps on with some good questions for this panel. I wanted to also just touch on influences with your work, because a few of the books here I sort of went, oh yeah, like when we were Sally, I kind of mentioned that, you know, I could sort of see those Murray Whelan and Lee Redhead, and I think Matthew, I could sort of sense of like American sort of thriller sort of approach to the narratives. Would you like to kind of maybe talk about some of the influences on your work, and who sort of inspired you to sort of go down this crime writing path?
It was The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, aged
right. It's
13 3/4.
A little bit
I think
different.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. So no,
that.
I was. I dug them out and I reread them recently, and I posted on Instagram, and I was like, oh my god, I've found, you know, 0.0 of my personality. Like I really. There's this thing about Adrian Mole, who's it's kind of. It was a book I read as a kid, but it's sort of more. You get a lot more out of it as an adult because you realise how much funny stuff is happening. Because he's essentially kind of a bit self-deluded. That's Adrian Mole's shtick. He's sort of, but he's also sometimes aware that he's not fully, that things aren't going as well as he might hope. But I think there was something about being really interested in what a character's misapprehensions or misunderstandings about the world are, and kind of working from there. And I know that's hard to draw a clear line from that to crime, but every single one of my characters is always labouring under some kind of misapprehension or some kind of misbelief about themselves. And so I can't be funny. That's why I'm jealous of people like Sally. I literally cannot do it. It just doesn't work. There are a couple of moments that I hope bring a bit of levity to Dirt Town, but on the whole, it is a hard story about a girl who goes missing. But I do think what pulled me to crime was more this decision to have a girl go missing and knowing what happened to her. So it wasn't that I went, okay, I'm going to take like Gary Tisha plus Jane Harper equals Hayley Scrivenor, because I hadn't read either of those writers. I wasn't very up with my crime reading. But I think I'm interested in what drives people to kind of maybe, I don't know, make extreme choices. Or it was really the setting kind of dictated the plot, and the plot dictated where I've landed. I'm not someone who went, right, this is the kind of book that I love and I'm going to write that. But there was a point at which I went, oh, this is what the reader's going to have these assumptions going into the work, and I made sure that I read really widely, and that I love crime. I love what it brings to that satisfaction of everything you're being told being for a reason, really suits my brain, and I enjoy that kind of plot But often when people ask you what your influences are, they're not looking for the truth in a way, like they're kind of looking for like what books are similar to yours. But I always try and put out there that whatever you love will kind of mix up in the big mush of your brain and will maybe come out with a story that you didn't necessarily expect or that doesn't seem like a foregone conclusion, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, the purpose of my question was not sort of for do the marketing comparison. I think it is actually really interesting to kind of see the influences that people have drawn on and have inspired them, because often, I mean, who would have picked Adrian Mole?
Well, and what's great is the reader always knows more than he does, and I think that's something that all crime writers have in common. We kind of like lying in wait for the reader a little bit, or at least I do. I really enjoy going, no, you don't know that yet, and I think that's what will keep me coming back to crime. I enjoy having more cards in my hand than the reader can kind of see. I think there's something deeply satisfying about that.
Although it's really annoying when a reader will come up to you and go, oh yeah, I picked it on page 1 because of X, and you go, I thought that was so well hidden. Does anyone else want to share some of their inspirations?
I do enjoy, I've always enjoyed the Janet Ivanovic books, the Stephanie Plum series, though they might have gone on a little bit too long. I haven't been sort of grabbing the recent ones.
34 or something?
I know, she's laughing all the way to the bank with those ones. But I did really enjoy the early ones. I quite like somewhat absurd crime. I really love Kate Atkinson's, like the Jackson Brodie books. Too, yeah. I really love those, even though, there's all these incredible coincidences, but she can make it believable. She's so good. So they're ones I love. I don't know if they've influenced me, but yes, I tend to like kind of slightly strange books.
Okay. I should probably plug that I'm doing a panel tomorrow with crime writing with comedy. So if other people have a bit of quirky sense of humour, they might like to pop along to that too. Matthew?
It's interesting you say American thriller with mine, because I think really for the setup of the book, I basically stole it from Red Dragon, which is, I mean, 2 families have been murdered in different cities, Atlanta and Birmingham, on full moons in America. And it's a sort of FBI more than a police thing, but they know what they're looking for, and obviously people know the book. The other thing is, which it relates a little bit to what you've been talking about, Shelley, is a book called I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which really came out, it's true crime, and it came out of these internet forums that Shelley's been talking about. And it's a great book. It's about the hunt for the Golden State Killer, who they've now found, and unfortunately the author of I'll Be Gone in the Dark died just before they found him, but she devoted decades of her life as an internet sleuth to trying to find this guy. And what I stole from that was they were geographically profiling him, because he sort of was before the advent of DNA, but he had a lot of crime scenes, and so they were looking at it geographically and thinking, with the spread, is he coming in or does he live here? And actually when they found him, again, it was an internet sleuth, not a professional police officer, had profiled him and said, we reckon he'll live here. And when they got him, he lived sort of a street across from that. So I stole a bit of that as well, just in the sort of geographic profiling that the police are doing. But I think, like Hayley, it's a lifetime of reading. And I mean, I loved Adrian Mole, and there's probably some Adrian Mole in Adam Bowman now that you mention it. But all sorts of other things. And books, I mean, I really tried to make Black River an entertainment. You meant to enjoy it. And so I would say books like Bonfire of the Vanities, which really you could look at as a crime book. There's a crime and there's a journalist and there are police officers, and just a lot of fun. So I suppose subconsciously things like that have probably influenced me as well.
We've got sort of time now to sort of start opening up to the floor. Do we have any questions? And the monitors come alive, so the people I think we've got one. We've got Lorraine down the back there. If the microphone could go that way, I'll ask one of the questions from our Zoom viewers. So in your debut novels, do your debut novels represent your first attempt to publish a book? And that's from Shelley Ray.
Well, I tried to get a fantasy novel published when I was 14. Didn't go so well. But aside from that, yes, Wake is my my first one that I've taken out on submission.
Yeah, same for me. Like I said, I this book was the result of a PhD, and I kind of did that PhD only having a few. I got into that PhD in creative writing with only a few kind of short stories under my belt, because I had this burning desire to write a novel, and I was really hoping the fact that I didn't enjoy short stories wasn't a bad sign. You know, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I could write a novel. Let's write a whole novel and find out. But it went through so many kind of it almost could have been abandoned at several points. But I think because I at least had that finished draft from the PhD, it became something that I was then able to use to enter manuscript prizes, and was able to develop the book through that. So that's one thing I really recommend for people writing their first book. And sometimes you do have to put it in a drawer, and maybe it'll be the next book that has to go in a drawer. But yeah, this was book zero.
The dreaded bottom drawer.
Yeah.
Well, I tried to write some romance novels, but I would always sabotage the characters, particularly the men. So I decided that wasn't my genre. And so this was, I think, my first finished manuscript. So, yeah, but it did take a while to get published.
Often happens.
Same for me without the romance novels, but so my first attempt, but it did take a while. And also, I mean, there'd be that much, at least maybe that much twice on the cutting room floor. So there was a lot of revision and probably 15 drafts over 4 years.
Yeah, I would back that. There was so much written that was discarded that I could have written sort of I think I had over 300,000
There's your
words.
sequel, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lorraine, do you want to just shout out your question?
So the question was, are we all plotters or pantsers? And my joke answer to this is like, some of you get to wear pants. Because I said I had this idea that a girl had gone missing, and one of the first things that came to me is I knew what had happened. So I guess I knew the ending in some sense, but I had no idea of how I was going to get there. The very first draft didn't even have characters like Ronnie and Lewis kind of as point of view characters at all. So I really make it up as I go along. But I was lucky to have that kind of lighthouse that I was heading for, that I knew what had happened to Esther Bianchi.
Did you add more characters with each draft? Or was it always?
Yeah, so the very first draft was only the chorus.
Yep.
And then I added kind of one character at a time, and I got to Detective Sergeant Sarah Michaels, and I shut the door and I said, no more point of view characters. That's it.
I was cutting characters out all the time.
I put some in, took them out again, all sorts of stuff, yeah.
Changed gender, changed name, everything. But no, I didn't know who done it in my book. 30,000 words into the book, I didn't know. So that should answer your question.
I'm a total pantser. It starts with this sort of locked room murder mystery incident, which was, I don't know, someone I'd heard put a body on the first page. So I just thought, I'll do that. And then I had to work out why, is it even relevant?
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'm the only plotter in the room then. That's interesting. I'm very much a plotter. I work from an outline. So my first draft is a very thorough outline. For my second book, my outline was 16 pages long. And I genuinely could not function without my outline. What I find when I'm writing is that I'll go through and I'll get stuck. And so I'll go back and I'll consult the outline. And every single time I figure out I'm stuck because there was something in a previous scene that I needed to add to make the story work from this point onwards. And that's why I'm stuck now, is, the gun that she needs to grab isn't on the mantelpiece in chapter 1. So that's why I don't know what to do now. And so I'm always really impressed by pantsers, because they don't have that scaffold that I am so dependent on. And it's very impressive.
How
Well,
detailed
we're impressed
is
by
it?
you, if it makes you feel better. That
It
idea that you would
does.
kind of have a sense of even who the main players are.
It does make me feel better. I did add characters. My publican Neil wasn't there until the second last draft, which is fascinating because he is so...
And is he your favourite now? Because he was the last one in. You're like, I love Neil.
He is my favourite. I love Neil so much.
So how detailed is your outline?
It's very detailed because I put anything in the outline that I don't want to forget. So sometimes it'll just be dot points, but sometimes the outline will have entire exchanges of dialogue in it. But often that dialogue, I went back to consult my outline when Wake went to print. I was feeling nostalgic, and I went back and I read the original outline, and I was amazed at how similar it was to the final product. But a lot of that dialogue that I'd put in was gone, particularly the jokes. They just didn't fit.
Oh, the poor old jokes. We have another question from our Zoom audience. Do you think someone could be a crime writer if they don't feel emotions strongly?
I want to jump in because I often talk about the fact that I write from a really deep emotional well. Like often I know the emotion and I don't know the specifics of what's happening. I just know the feeling that I want to capture. But I think what's really dangerous about giving any kind of writing advice or speaking on any kind of panel is that when you are trying to write, which we were all people trying to do that at one point, and we know the sort of desperate, for me it was an incredibly lonely and anxiety-inducing process of like, who am I to think that I can do this thing that I love so much? I had such reverence for words and books. But I think, and I wrote an article about this for Melbourne Writers Festival, had a special series on ambition, and they asked writers to respond to it. And I said, I kind of landed on this idea that every writer at some point has believed that they are commencing to write from an inherently flawed position. So something about the way they do it is inherently wrong and flawed from the beginning, therefore they are doomed to failure. So if you feel that feeling, it's probably a really good sign. That is all I would say. So rather than kind of directly addressing your question, because I would say that emotion is very important in how I write, I think don't be afraid that there seems to be this huge sort of impassable obstacle, because it's often, tell me if I'm wrong, like if any of you never felt that feeling, maybe my theory is wrong, but I do think it's what I wish I'd heard, that it's very common to feel like there is some distinct roadblock that will stop you specifically from writing something of value.
And it's funny, with all of the interviews I've done with writers, it's actually that sort of self-belief is, or lack of self-belief is almost universal. And it's someone telling that writer that they have something that's worth pursuing. It's a mentor who's kind of said, keep at it, rather than sort of the roadblocks that is sort of, it's just sort of someone believing them.
Having said that, I do think one other thing all writers share is some ability to deal with feedback. And it doesn't matter that you don't love it or that you don't feel great about it, but you have to find a way to incorporate it. I do think that might be the one thing that sort of could be impassable. If you are only writing and never able to share or never able to take on what other people think about your story, then that can be an incredibly difficult thing to get through.
Yeah. So
can I just jump in, with something really quickly? That's such an amazing answer. But I'd also like to add that there's a really diverse readership in crime in particular. And there's a lot of readers out there who really are just interested in the technical detail, and they just want something that goes really deep into forensics. There's horses for courses.
Yeah, it's, crime is such a broad church. If you have an interest, there will generally be some sort of crime little genre that will tap into it. So it's sort of,
and I think your best shot is always to write the thing that only you can write, in a way. So someone else wouldn't be able to do that thing that you feel is a flaw in your writing, for example.
Do we have any other questions from the floor? Yep, down the front. So the question is, now having published just repeating it for the Zoom audience, now having published in crime, are you limited to that genre, or do you feel that you are able to explore other?
I don't feel limited. I still like crime. I think I'm still going to persist with crime, but if I had an idea for a story that didn't really fit within crime, like Family Saga or something, I'd just go with it.
Luckily my agent's not here, but no, I think I do feel that I now have to write probably 2 more books with the same character in the same genre. And then, I'll write the sprawling Booker Prize winner after that, yeah.
Well, my agent is here. Hi, Grace. But I did sign a 2-book deal, and we talked about what the next book would be. But I think that sense of, I know the only way I'm going to write anything half decent is if I follow the heat if I follow what I actually want to do. For this book, the next one coming, luckily someone is dead on the first few pages, so like I'm good for this book. But I do think what readers want and what any publisher want, anyone involved in books wants you to write the best book that you possibly can. So I totally understand the question, and I think it's really good of you, Matthew, to say, look, there are practical, there are expectations and there are those things. But I think finding a way to be excited about your own book is essential. And if you're not excited, the reader will be able to tell.
And we do actually, like, there are authors working across genres. I mean, Pamela Hart is one who's in multiple genres. Jack Heath is another one who writes, I mean, they're all kind of adventure, but he also has his kind of quite gory crime strand as well. So I think it is possible to manage that thing. And I think that Hayley is right. It's about sort of following that, your passion and because if you're interested in it, there's going to be a reader that's interested in it.
Shelley?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Jack Heath because he writes one type of book for children and young adults and a different type for adults, which he said was easier to do because young adults tend to age out of their authors anyway. And so he didn't have a long-standing audience that would be upset if he changed genres. For me personally, I can't see ever going back to fantasy because I love to read fantasy, but it just takes an extraordinary level of skill to build an entire world that the reader cares about enough to care that I'm then endangering it. I have at least 4 more crime books that I could theoretically write that I'm enthusiastic about. So I think I'll be there for a fair while yet, but I don't feel like I have to do that. And I'd like to explore maybe horror and I did try romance. It's interesting what you said, Sally, because I had a similar problem, is that I would set out to write a bubbly rom-com and suddenly everybody was talking about their childhood trauma. So that's probably not for me.
Oh, look, and that's probably a good point for us to finish. I thought we were going to get one more question, but we are getting the wind up. So thank you to our panel. If the audience would like to show their appreciation. And remember that we are having a signing out the front where you can purchase a copy of all these books. And I'd also just like to say thank you to our volunteers who are going to be here for the entire weekend. And I encourage you also to say hello to the volunteers because a number of them are also published authors. So you might be able to have quite an interesting conversation as you're standing in the queue waiting to get your book signed. So yes, thank you all again. Thank you to all of you who have joined us on Zoom around the state, and hopefully I think we've got some from Queensland as well. So thank you all for participating, and I hope you have a fantastic Bad Festival. Thank you.